afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our next program, focusing on memoir and the craft of telling a personal story to an audience. Lydia Millet has written more than a dozen novels and short story collections, including Dinosaurs and a children's Bible, which was the finalist for the National Book Award in Fiction and one of the New York Times Book Review's Best 10 Books of 2020. Her first work of nonfiction, We Loved It All, was released this spring. NICOLE CHUNG'S A Living Remedy was named a New York Times Notable Book of 2023 and a Best Book of the Year by over a dozen outlets. Her 2018 debut, All You Can Ever Know, was a national bestseller and finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. They'll be interviewed by Donna, Seaman, an adult books editor at Booklist and a member of the American Writers Museum Content Leadership Team. Welcome to you all.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for being here. It's great to see a full room. We're here to talk about memoirs. The memoir has evolved into a potent and compelling literary form, an encompassing mode of inquiry into complex matters and sensitive issues. Memoir is a risky form of storytelling that draws on facts and feelings in a tricky balance of disclosure and omission. We have two exceptional memoir writers here today to talk about the genre and their experiences. And NICOLE and Lydia, I wanted to start with what I think is always the beginning of writing, and that would be reading. And you each write a bit about your young selves. NICOLE, do you want to start and talk about reading and writing?
Sure. I mean, it seems fitting that we're in a library to answer this question, because I was definitely one of those kids for whom like the school library and my community library were havens. I was one of those kids who asked for a pass to go to the library at recess. So didn't always get one, but always asked. So, I mean, these were really stories. It was interesting. There were many stories in which I didn't necessarily see like myself or my like transracial adoptee experience represented, but they were like incredible, like life-giving stories all the same. And I think that's really what made me want to become a writer, is just the fact that I was lucky to be a reader from so young. And there's so much too about writing a memoir specifically that I think can feel like a reclamation. Like, as an act of storytelling, really, it's sort of a chance to rewrite your own story, or not to just wildly make up facts, of course, but to like reframe your story and tell it on your terms, and just have that opportunity to say what these experiences have meant, and sift through memory and decide like what's really important to you, what matters most to you. So yeah, I think very much for me, as for many writers, like my love of writing was born through this like love of reading.
Thank you. Lydia?
Yeah, yes, reading. We didn't have a TV when I was little, and we got one when I was about 12. And I briefly mention this in this book because my parents, who didn't really approve of TVs, were forced to buy one because all three of their kids were like just hanging out at the neighbors' houses all the time, and they were humiliated by we would also like eat all the food at the neighbors' houses because we didn't have much junk food at my house. So we were just like leeches. We were just like parasites in the neighborhood. So my parents were forced to. Anyway, we just were huge readers all through childhood. We didn't realize there was also the glory of the visual media. So, but I am a very unsurprising product, I feel, of my household, because we would just like sit together reading, in the same way we had cats instead of dogs. Cats were sort of like solitary and together, and we were solitary and together also.
I love it. We had a television, but we were restricted. I think I was allowed 1 hour. Right. So maybe that's how readers are really, lifelong readers are made. Anymore, yeah. So you both write about your families. NICOLE, your first memoir, All You Can Ever Know, you talk about a lot of things that you did not talk to your parents about when you were younger. The thing about memoir is, what do you put in, what do you leave out? How do you, how much do you worry about how other people are going to feel about it? And I wonder if you could talk about that first memoir and taking those chances.
Sure. So I mean, every writer who writes about the people in their lives, they're going to have kind of their own like rules or preferences around it. So these are just mine. One of my rules with my first book specifically was like no surprises, in that I just didn't want like the book to be the first place that, like, for instance, my adoptive parents learned I had feelings about race that were different than theirs or something. Like, so it meant that like I didn't write something that we hadn't had conversations about. And a lot of that was just like time. A lot of it was waiting. I feel like by the time I actually sat down to write that book, you know, thankfully we'd had the chance to have a lot of conversations that we didn't really have when I was growing up. And at the same time, I think it was sometimes like really difficult reading for them, because our feelings about our family and about my adoption and about like my search for my birth family, like those were, as loving and as supportive as they were, like we had very different experiences of those things. It really drives home for me like the subjectivity of memoir and the fact that it's kind of a fundamentally like undemocratic thing that one writer gets to decide what memories to share with you and then tell you kind of what they mean. If one of my parents were to write a book about my adoption, it would obviously look very, very different from that first book, and it doesn't mean either one of us is lying or, you know, not telling even like the whole truth as we see it. It's highly subjective. So I'm showing you one view in my memoir, filtered through my experience and my perspective. There's whole vistas you're not really gonna glimpse necessarily, because I'm the one telling it, and I'm the one telling it at a very specific point in time. I think what helps me sort of sift through and figure out like what belongs though is very much the story. Like for me, like the writing and the story, it comes first, and you develop a sense of kind of what fits and what doesn't. And when I'm first writing and drafting, I have to tell myself no one will ever read it or I can't continue. So like I don't picture people I know reading it until I'm like deep in revision. And then it becomes a question of like, if I'm concerned how they'll take something, do we have a conversation about it? Do I like, you know, talk all that out with them beforehand? And that's kind of what I've opted for, is just like showing drafts early, having like the conversations we need to have well ahead of publication. But yeah, knowing that it's ultimately just my experience and perspective that I can share kind of helps me in a way. Like it takes the pressure off. It reminds me what the project is, which is very much like my experience and my perspective. So yeah, I'm lucky though in that, I mean, my various family members and people in my life have been not just understanding of that, but like very supportive, I think. And at one point my father said something to me like this is just not the book we would have written about our family, and that's okay. Like the point is, it's your book, it's your life, it's your experience, and it's valid. And that, you know, that meant a great deal to me.
For sure. So Lydia, it's a very different experience for you. This is your first nonfiction book, and I was very intrigued by what inspired you to write this, and I'm intrigued by your subtitle. So I wonder if you could talk about A Memory of Life, and what sort of memoir this is, and why you wrote it.
So this book of mine is, well, it's the first time I haven't, you know, set out to write lies, you know, so that was like quite difficult for me. The thing is sort of a hybrid of bits of my own life and then sort of glimpses, the windows onto these other things, and I sort of made myself, you know, sort of maybe like the MC or like supposed to be sort of the character, just leading maybe the reader through a certain labyrinth or whatever. I found that I couldn't write this book without like being a character in it, because you needed someone to hold on to, just to sort of to steer through it, the sort of forest or whatever, labyrinth, I guess. Yes, so what was the question? Yeah, so I had two problems in terms of what Donna's question was to Nicole. One was like having to do with, and I'm sure a lot of nonfiction writers of things, especially other than memoir, have this problem, but sort of how much does your readership know about certain more objective conditions? And you know, and when are you telling them stuff they already know? And I was horrified that I might be telling people something they already knew, because I have no attention span, and I didn't want people to be impatient with anything in it. And so that was it was hard for me to know how much of a knowledge base would be there. And, you can never answer that question. It's unanswerable, really. And then the other thing was, how much do I put in, and what do I put in of my own life, what's relevant and what's not? And I was helped in that actually by a good friend of mine who's also an ex-boyfriend who read an early draft and was like, why are you telling those old stories that all your friends already know again? He was like, I was just bored by that. So I actually did, but he was right. There was like this sort of dross in there that I was so used, you're so used to telling the story of your own life in a way, even if you're not writing a book about it. You have this sort of canon of moments or things that sort of give people that are a shorthand to sort of who you are when you're first getting to know people, and you trot out this sort of canon sometimes, right, of little stories about yourself. And I was sort of doing that. So I ended up just really cutting the whole thing down a lot to be a lot shorter. It was much too long at first. And then the other thing, the subtitle, well, it turns out that your publisher forces you to have a subtitle. Because, right? Essentially, it at least has to say a memoir or even a novel, right? It can't just be there the name of the thing. It always has to have its genre. The category has to be right there so that it can be flogged to consumers. And so they were leaning toward just calling it a memoir. But I didn't feel entirely comfortable with that description of it because memoir has sort of different connotations. This book isn't primarily about me. It's just that I'm kind of there in it, to provide a human sort of presence within it. But so I sort of split the difference with memory.
And memory of life. So we'll come back around to what is in this book. But Nicole, so your second memoir, A Living Remedy, kind of picks up the story, and you write about your parents. And in both your books, what interests me is how you tell your story and how it extrapolates out to cover really major social issues as well, the communal. And in this book, we end up reading a lot about failures of the healthcare system and other financial things. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, about how a story evolves into a larger consciousness and what you hope to achieve by that.
Sure. So initially, before A Living Remedy was A Living Remedy, in that I had no title. The titles are hard and very difficult. And I think I think it was the very last thing that came together for this book, actually. But initially, when I conceived of the book, it was more tightly focused on my grief for my father, who died young at 67, and how in so many ways his death was what my friend called a common American death. It was sped in so many ways by precarity, by lack of access to healthcare, by different failures of the social safety net at really key moments for my father and my mother. And they were in this group of a very large group of people who were getting older with kind of less and less of what they needed, less support, less steady employment, less health care. Everything was more expensive. And so, it's interesting, my mother and I were so far apart politically and ideologically in many ways, but one thing we were both grappling with together, some common area that really surprised us in a way after my father died, was this sense that his death at 67 wasn't inevitable. It didn't have to happen. It had happened because so many other things had happened. And I was actually reading a lot of grief stories, both fiction and nonfiction at the time. It was my first major loss. I was flailing, and books had always been there for me. And I was like, okay, reading is going to be partly how I process this, And I loved, and I was really grateful for many of those stories, but I did notice how many, they seemed to be dealing with grief, from the perspective of people who are primarily white and upper middle class or upper class, which is not how most people in this country face illness, face crisis, face loss. I didn't write this book because I didn't feel seen in those stories. It's a little too simple, but I thought this is such a common experience. Like, you know, for my mother and me, there was no facing our grief for my father without also like naming these like structural failings. And I thought if I need to do that in some way, maybe other people like need to see that in some way, or maybe that's something that should be like represented or part of like our grief literature. So that kind of started me down the road of thinking about this book, and of course it changed a great deal in the writing, and because it's memoir, it changes as your life changes. So, you know, I wouldn't have envisioned the pandemic at that point. But yeah, I'm sorry, I feel like I've lost the thread of your question now, but I never set out to like preach or lecture. I didn't set out to write a polemic, but I do feel presenting the facts of what happened to my father, to my family, like the facts alone are sufficiently damning. And also I think something that a lot of people can relate to or have experienced within their families or communities. So, but for me, it was just an aspect of my grief that I needed to like put words to, try to put language to.
Yes, and I mean, I pulled that out, but it's completely integral to the story. There's no soapboxing at all. It's all really in there. And the same for you, Lydia. So grief is an essence of your book as well. And we're talking about planetary grief here. A memory of life is, you look at life on Earth, you take us way back before our species appeared, and then you bring us to the present where species are disappearing. So I wonder if, you know, you could talk a bit about that, a little bit of your background as a conservationist, and people who have read your novels know how much you care about the living world and how much you know about it, but you really step up to the front here and put on your environmentalist hat for us.
Yeah, so I have worked, since the 90s, basically, have worked in conservation as my day job, and also have been a writer that whole time. My first novel was published, I think, in 96. So I was in my 20s then. So I've always kind of led this a bit of a double life around. And I only really began to write about matters of climate in the past several books, but I've always sort of written about animals and plants to some degree. Just always been really fascinated with the other critters, you know. And I see a lot out there in the world now reflecting my own fascination with them. There is just like a tremendous amount of love, actually, that I'm seeing in the human world for what some people call the more than human world these days. I think increasingly as things become clearly more threatened and fragile, people are recognizing that they have this sort of deep, unplumbed love for some of the inhabitants of our world that we remember less often, and that we see less often in the urban spaces that we live in. So in this book, I was for the first time sort of just writing for the first time in a book form, writing about that sort of love that we have for the others and all forms of otherness, how important those forms are to who human beings are, and how sort of other animals are at the basis of our language historically and our art historically from the earliest times that we were human, and sort of how crucial it is to keep them with us here on Earth, to be the best critters that we can be. So.
Yes, thank you. So you write, both of you address what I guess I'll just call false narratives. The idea that, you know, a family can be multiracial and there won't be any problems, that people won't have different experiences in Nicole's case. In your case, you write about sort of denial of environmental problems. So Nicole, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how in both your memoirs you sort of address assumptions and biases that people might not even be aware of, and how you connect that to your story. That's such an important element of storytelling.
Sure. You know, I think, like, of course, like when I write, the story comes first for me, so I'm always thinking about, like, how can I turn this experience into, like, art or something that other people can enjoy, or more to the point will help them help you. Like, think about moments in your own life. The point of reading a memoir isn't necessarily to get you to think about me and what's happened to me. I think when the genre really works, it's a place where you also meet yourself, right? You think about what has happened to you. You think about your relationships, your lives and your loves and your losses. I think if you pick up a book and like a work of memoir and that's what happens for you, the book's kind of doing its job. So I don't really like necessarily set out to like correct biases or assumptions. But I will say, like, All You Can Never Know is one of the first, not the first, but like one in a small group of transracial adoptee memoirs written by transracial adoptees. And I guess to some degree I was writing into a space that, where the stories about adoption tended to be primarily from the perspective of white people and adopters, or the adoption industry, not so much the people who were adopted. I was just telling my story, and I thought it was a good story. It was a search for my birth family, like what happened when I grew up and looked for them and what I discovered. I was like, it's almost like a mystery novel. I'm like, anybody can pick this up and get into this. You know, they'll wonder what I found. They'll keep turning pages. They'll learn something. But I do recognize that book in many ways is like complicating a narrative many people think is quite simple about adoption being a happy ending, or adoption being a simple story, or love always being enough, you know, within a family. And so while there was a lot of love in my family and, you know, I was very, very close to my parents, there was still a larger story, I think, to tell there about the discussions that we found hard to have, you know, about race and culture, and just my own feelings about my adoption being different than theirs. Like, I grew up with a sense of kind of like loss, or the idea of something missing or something I wanted to know about that I couldn't know about. And like, they didn't have that. So that was just an obvious difference. But putting language to that was hard for me. With the second book, I think the myth I'm taking on is more the American dream, or this idea of bootstrapping, and like, if you just work hard and pay your dues, like, you'll rise and you'll be able to bring everybody you love with you. Something I think I was raised to believe in, has like quite a hold on a lot of people still, and something that I had to kind of unlearn. So again, I don't think I necessarily set out to like, I'm not trying to teach you a lesson necessarily with my books, but just by stating the facts and by complicating narratives that people tend to think of as maybe more simplistic than they really are in reality, you know, maybe that the books provide like a widened perspective in that way.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much. So Lydia, in your book, you bring up many myths, as Nicole was just referring to, and you talk in really, I think, original ways about different beliefs that made us feel elevated above the other animals on the planet, and how much damage that has done. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your research and how you turn that into a story. I mean, it's a narrative, and again, like Nicole was saying, you're not it's no textbook, but we learn a lot, and you shift our perspective on, you know, the triumph of progress, that sort of thing. And, but also, you know, Christianity and capitalism as forces that ended up degrading the environment to such a huge extent.
Yeah, it's just really hard to even like approach this on a panel like this, you know, because it's really
huge.
such a vast subject, and many of these are just really vast subjects. But I do one thing I sort of homed in on in this was the dominance, particularly in the United States, in the stories we tell, which are, you know, obviously the way that our brains make meaning out of the world, that the narrative coherence is literally how we are able to operate in the world, right, by story making. And many of the stories we tell that are really big, expensive, popular stories that a lot of people participate in, those stories are about like one hero, you know, and there's this idea of rising above the rest, you know, of triumphing, triumphing, of sort of conquest, even now, right, of sort of being better than the others, this model of competition in how we ideate ourselves, right? So there's, in such a deep way, ingrained in us now competitiveness that it's how we view ourselves. Our spirit, is one of conquest, and in these narratives often. And I'm talking about there are some kinds of books like this, but very much it's very clear in so many of the really say big budget movies that we all go to, or those or shows. I mean, I'm not singling out movies. All the visual media that are really blown up are really about how one person rises, right? And I think that right now we need to tell different stories that are not about how one person rises and subdues everything else and is superior to others among people or among the rest of the world.
If I may just jump off on, as you were speaking, it hadn't occurred to me till you just now, but I've also read and loved Lydia's book. And maybe one other common thread is what you're talking about. There's so much focus in our culture on individualism, what we individually can do or what we individually can save, or even in a somewhat healthier, what is our personal responsibility to the earth, to each other. But we don't talk enough about collectively, collective action and what do we owe each other. And how do we get there together? And we saw that, of course, during the pandemic very recently, but also in nearly every other area of our social and cultural lives. I really appreciate that about your book.
Well, thank you. And yeah, there is that commonality, I think, in what you're writing about too, the collective, right? But I also think that we, specifically as Americans, and I grew up as in Canada, even though I was always American, but I grew up from when I was 2 till 17 or something, I was in Canada. So perhaps the Canadians have, invaded my psyche. But I have really felt ever since, since forever, that we have as Americans this knee-jerk fear of not being allowed to be individuals, or our individualism somehow might be suppressed by an evil force or whatever. But there's really so little in terms of there's so little chance of our private minds actually being taken away from us. I mean, we are people, we are persons, we have personhood. Our selfhood will not vanish. I mean, of course it can be eroded by, in certain insidious ways, right? But no one is coming to take the self from us out of some kind of cruel design. And I think that we should, much as we value the privacy of our mind, I know that I deeply value the privacy of my mind, and the idea of other people reading my thoughts is truly horrifying, right? It's just terrifying. So I value that privacy as much as any libertarian perhaps, but also to I think survive and thrive in the world that we're grappling with now. We really have to bend ourselves toward neighborhoods and communion and a larger whole. There's just no way to continue in a healthy way without relinquishing a bit of our fear about being infringed upon, because everything is interdependent, and science shows us that more every day, among other, fields.
Right. Yes, indeed. So, listening to you both talk about this idea of communal, I was very struck by how both of you, as having children, as mothers, I felt like that sort of charged some of your feelings about telling these stories, about addressing your own past, perhaps to share. Maybe children don't always want to listen to those stories as they get older, but maybe there's, you turn it into a book. But also that sense of responsibility and that looking to the future, what are we leaving? What are we, what have we done, and how are the future generations going to live that way? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. The feeling of looking at the next generation and writing stories, and even thinking about your next books too. Where is this taking you?
That's a good question. It's a hard question. I think I was more conscious of, the role that motherhood and just like being a parent and the idea of legacy, I was more conscious of that maybe with the first book, just because I write in that book about how what really kicked off my search in earnest for my birth family was the fact that I was expecting my first child. And it just brought up all these things. I think I would have eventually searched for them anyway, I do, but that's what gave me like the real kick to do it right then at that point in my life. And then so, I mean, it is a memoir about that search and what I discovered, but it's happening alongside, like, my family's expanding in multiple ways in that book, and it felt like my identity was too, right? Which is what happens in some ways when you become a parent. And for me, like, that happened also when I found my birth family, like literally the same month that I gave birth. So when I set out to tell that story, I was more conscious of the role that like parenthood had played in the events, and also like the idea of having a family history, which as an adoptee, I did not grow up knowing or having. I still don't have like everything, of course. None of us really do, but I had so much more, and I thought this is one way I write it all down. I can give it to them, not just to them. A book's an object in the world, but like there's a reason that book is dedicated to my sister, Cindy, my birth sister, and our daughters. There's this idea of like what we didn't know, how we put our family kind of back together, and what we were hoping our children would have that we didn't. I don't know that it came into my thinking as much with the second book, but I've never like written publicly before children. I had kids young, and so my writing career and my like life as a mother have always been kind of intertwined. I have a lot of like rules and boundaries for myself around like what I'll write about my kids or about their experience, but I do sometimes take a lot of joy in like thinking about and writing about like my parenthood experience with them, and just like the role that that's played. I think the main way it comes into A Living Remedy is sort of the tension in that sandwich generation period of life where I have young children, needy children, and I'm trying to care for parents with increasing needs. Again, a really common experience, I think, for a lot of people. Just feeling like in every direction I felt like I was not able to do enough. So that was like something that I really kind of wanted to find language for as well. And like maybe part of it was a way of reassuring myself that like I was doing what I could, and that had to be enough, even if it didn't feel like it, you know, in the moment.
Thank you. Lydia?
Oh, yeah. So I think in this book about just sort of extending our notion of parenthood. You know, it's I'm always delighted when friends of mine decide not to have children, because I think that's a great decision for most people. I mean, for so many people, and would have probably been a rational decision for me too. I'm very happy to know my children and have them, but you know, sometimes we do good things for the wrong reasons or something, or maybe it's not a good thing, but we'll always believe it is. Anyway, that's another thing entirely. But I do think a lot about you know, how narrowly or broadly we should construe what it means to be a parent, because I do see so much like devotion and dedication in parents. Like it's just one of those things that it's a place where we still really feel a duty of care, right, as a culture. Like we seem to be losing cohesion in so many communities. You know, we're not as, say, given to like religion in certain ways as we used to be, certain forms of religion that are communal. So much is about the self now in our culture, right? But kids, having them once we have them, however we came by them, whether they're adopted or biological or whatever, you know, there really is this kind of sacred duty. And I kind of feel, what if we extended that duty beyond just our children and toward other children and toward the children of other species and the young everywhere that really need a livable world to grow up in and to find beautiful, you know. And so I discuss that sort of notion that we could be the parents of more than just our own children, and what that might look like.
Yes, beautifully put. Thank you. So this time is going so fast. I'm just going to ask one more question of you both. And since I think there's a lot of writers here, I guess I'd ask, what advice would you give someone who's thinking about writing a memoir?
So, I mean, I'll put on my editor hat for a minute. I actually feel much more qualified to give advice in that sense, and I worked as an editor for nearly a decade. So where my job was helping other writers tell their stories, often personal stories. And I guess I would say, like, the times when I felt they were most successful in that. And by that, I don't mean like the most clicks or the most sales or anything. I mean like the writer was the happiest and felt that they had come the closest to saying the thing they wanted to say, like to telling the true story they wanted to tell. It was often when like they were ready to tell that story. And sometimes we might think we're ready, but like there's work we still need to do with ourselves or with our families or in our communities or what have you. Like, I don't think you need to wait as long as I waited to write All You Can Ever Know. I spent like my whole life in some sense, like sort of preparing to tell that story, but I'm glad I did it when I did, because I think if I'd tried to, say, 5 years earlier, I'm not sure I would have been able to, or I'm not sure it would have been the book it needed to be. I'm not sure I would have been ready to deal with the feedback when you get like criticism, not just literary criticism, but just reader feedback on a very personal story. You have to be kind of ready for that. It hits a little different, I think, than perhaps other genres, because it is literally your life and your choices and your family and all of that. I don't mean you have to like develop thick skin or wait till you feel like, I don't know, like you've reached a certain level of wisdom or knowledge. I definitely don't feel like I did that, but I felt like I had like done the work I needed to do in my life, in my family, like in my communities to tell that story and deal with whatever came, you know. And I don't know that I would have been able to do that sooner. And you should just know you don't owe anybody like your traumas or the worst or the hardest things that have happened to you. I've written 2 really serious, intense books, but I try to, when I can, like follow the joy or the fun or the humor too. I think that's really important. I don't, and like, writing advice also would just be like to stretch your neck, stretch your back, like do it a lot, do it way more than you think you need to, because every writer has a messed up back. So like just do it now so you don't need PT like I did. And then like, that's my other great piece of writing advice.
That's excellent. Thank you, Nicole.
And I think I would just say probably the same thing I always say about whatever you're writing, which is like, just make sure you read a lot, you know, because that's the best thing you can ever do anyway. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you. You brought us back to the beginning, a perfect circle. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nicole and Lydia. You were fabulous.
Thank you, Donna.